That's right. We're talking about crashing today, but not that Dave Matthews Jam. We're talking about the stock market crash and the Great Depression. Not going to lie, it's pretty depressing, but that's okay because eventually, later this week, we're going to get into talking about the New Deal and how we're going to get ourselves out of this. The New Deal, which, no spoilers, it did a lot, but what actually sort of finally got us out of the hole of the Great Depression was World War II. But we'll get into that later. For now, let's talk Great Depression and let's talk causes of the Great Depression. This is a very famous photo. This is a migrant worker. Upton Sinclair was a journalist at the time. He says the Great Depression was one of abundance, not of scarcity. And I don't know if you guys have seen that photo. It's a famous photo, but here's what we're looking at. Development. What economic developments set the stage for this? How did the stock market crash and the Great Depression affect people's choices of where to live? We've put a lot of emphasis on geography or the significance of locations this semester. Cultural diversity. How and why might various ethnic groups be affected differently by an economic depression? Some things in a depression are universal and some are not. And it probably shouldn't be a surprise that different ethnic groups experienced it differently. So this image up here, that is Florence Thompson from the 1930s, who came to be associated with the Great Depression for years to come. Thompson was a poor migrant mother at the time. Like so many others, the expressions of worry and anguish on her face literally speak of the mood of thousands of others during the same time. It really does show just like extreme worry. The image has been reprinted in various magazines, newspapers, and journals over the years. It has become a symbol of sorts of the Great Depression. In 1929, the stock market crashed, causing financial ruin for millions of Americans. The collapse of the stock market was one of several factors that gave rise to the Great Depression. And when Hoover, that's Herbert Hoover, when Hoover's efforts to revive the economy failed, Americans elected a Democratic president, Franklin D. Roosevelt, to reverse the country's economic decline. So here's what we're going to be able to do. We want to define continuity and change, cause and effect, comparing and contrasting. We want to identify patterns of those things, utilize the patterns, and finally evaluate. Keep this in mind as we're going. How important is public confidence in the health of the economy? Right now, there's not a lot of confidence, and this isn't a current events class, but it's funny how these things come in cycles. So, as the prosperity, I'm not sure if you guys are familiar with that term, but it can mean success in a number of ways. But when we say prosperity, when we're talking Great Depression, obviously we're talking about a booming economy. So as the prosperity of the 1920s ended, severe economic problems gripped the nation. GNP decreases from 104 billion in 1929 to 59 billion in 1932. GNP is gross national product. You guys probably studied that when you took economics, but that's a huge decrease. That's almost half in just 3 years. So that should go a long way towards telling you how severe this depression was. 90,000 businesses went bankrupt. That's a huge number. It's especially huge during that era when there weren't nearly as many businesses. Unemployment went up from 3% or 1.6 million in 1929 to 25% or 13 million in 1933. Currently, the rate is, let me look that up for you, because right now it's really on the rise. So let's see. Yeah, so I looked it up, and right now they're projecting that the unemployment rate in the United States through 2021 is going to be 6%. And that's a very big number, a huge number. So the fact that it was 25%, that 1 out of every 4 Americans were out of work in 1933, that's colossal. By 1932, industrial output was less than half of what it was in 1929. So our factory system was just really drying up. By November 1929, investors in the United States had lost more than $30 billion. To give you an idea of how much money that was more than the federal government spent on a world war. So the money that was lost by investors in the stock market crash exceeded the total amount that the U.S. spent to fight World War I. 600 banks closed. And again, these numbers are colossal by any standard, but when you consider it's 1929, that's huge. By 33, 11,000 of 25,000 U.S. banks closed. So what is that? 11,000 divided by 25,000. 44% of the banks in the United States went out of business. And by 1933, 28 states literally didn't have a bank. Unfortunately, with all of this turmoil and uncertainty and poverty and struggle, suicide rates rose. And people getting married and having kids declined. There are stories that stockbrokers were falling from the roofs, like, whatever falls, super fast, falling like rocks, like rain, whatever. There's no actual evidence that there was like an abundance of people jumping off of high rises. It did happen, but still, the suicide rate rose 30%. So, like I said in the intro, the New Deal and the programs that Roosevelt implements during the New Deal really go a long way towards getting us moving in the right direction. But if you see our timeline that we're using in this class, uh, started in 1929, ended in World War II, the worst economic depression in history. Many Americans blamed the world economy and massive war debts. So we spent a lot of money on World War One, but relatively speaking, other countries in Western Europe spent more. They spent a greater percentage of their GDP, and they lost a higher percentage of their workforce. So, and their infrastructure was destroyed more. They actually got bombed and hosted battles. So a lot of Americans blamed it on the Europeans, foreigners. World War II, if you could guess what would resurrect the economy during then, well, Suddenly, like we did in World War One, except even bigger, there was this call to mobilize factories and to get factories cranking out material for the war. So that's going to be really what finally pushes it over the edge. We're not going to worry about this. Let's see if this will let us watch. It might not. Sometimes these things work for me, sometimes they don't. So Black Thursday and Black Tuesday. Now you guys have heard of Black Friday, where this mob is going into a Walmart to buy flat screen. We're going to talk Black Thursday, Black Tuesday. Look at that. $100 will buy this car. Must have cash. Lost all on the stock market. Stocks were seen for a while after World War One, really since the invention of the stock market, but especially after the war, as an opportunity to grow your wealth exponentially in a short amount of time. In other words, get rich quick. And as stock sales increased, demand increased. Problem is, there was such an increase for increased demand for stocks that people were buying stocks at a price that really they didn't deserve. So a lot of stocks were selling for more than they were actually worth. Black Tuesday comes along October 29th, 1929, and that's when the proverbial doo-doo hits the fan and it all crashes. General Motors executive John J. Rashcobb urged Americans to invest, claiming anyone who invested $15 a month in the stock market for 20 years would end up with $80,000, a fortune at the time. Margin buying. Buying on margin is a major factor in the crash. Margin buying. Investors would buy stocks on borrowed money. If stocks fell, they would find themselves deep in debt. Very risky. In other words, they were taking out loans to purchase stocks. Well, that's all fine and dandy if your stocks are appreciating. But when your stocks lose their value, suddenly you're unable to pay that loan. So if you had money in your savings account and you said, okay, I'm going to invest this money in the stock market, well, if those stocks lose their value, then you're back down at zero, or whatever you put in, you've lost it. Well, suddenly, if you're investing money not that came from your savings, but that you borrowed from a lender, well, you've not only lost the value of your stock, but you've now lost the ability to pay back your lender. So this stock speculation, playing the market, basically trying to buy low and sell high. There were not very many regulations. Of course, when one of the results of the stock market crash is going to be a major increase in regulation. Black Thursday is 24th. People are starting to panic. For the first time in a long time, supply is starting to exceed demand. And then 5 days later, that's when it truly uh, explodes. So Black Thursday, they see a big dip. People start selling, but then it sort of corrects itself. Tuesday, it all goes in the toilet. Problems in the stock market. Deluge of panic selling overwhelms market. 19 million shares change hands. Prices tumble like an avalanche. Wild scenes till great financiers come to rescue. The worst crash in the history of Wall Street took place yesterday. Wow. So problems buying on margin, speculation, lack of regulation. The Dow Jones, that was and is really the most widely used barometer or scale and measuring device for the stock market's health. Dow's measured by based on the stock prices of 30 representative large firms trading on the New York Stock Exchange. So there are 30 large investment firms, and they more or less average their stock prices, and that's what determines the industrial average. Stock, you guys who have taken economics probably know this, but a stock is essentially a share of an ownership in a company. So through most of the hold on, somebody just shut up at my door, guys. All right. Where were we, guys? Okay, so stock, just to repeat, a share of ownership in a company, and a company that you can purchase stock in, we call that publicly traded. So Coca-Cola, for example, is a publicly traded company, which means you can purchase stock in it. And a stock, you'll hear the word share used. People say, yeah, I bought 50 shares of Apple. And basically that's representing that in a general way, you're a partial owner of that company, even if it's just a tiny segment. Through most of the 1920s, stock prices rose steadily. The Dow had reached a high of 381 points, nearly 300 points higher than it had been 5 years earlier. We call this a bull market. Any period, and this is not just a term from the Great Depression, it's a general economics term, financial term. A bull market is what we call it when stocks are going up. And a bear market is when stocks are going down. So you can just think a bull, if they're trying to gore somebody with their horns, their head goes from down to up, right? But a bear, if a bear is trying to paw you, it goes from up to down. So it had been a bull market for a long time. By 1929, about 4 million Americans, or 3%, of the nation's population owned stock. The current statistics for the amount of citizens who own stock, it was 3% in 29. Now I'm stalling. 55% of Americans report that they own stock. So a giant increase, but still this 3% was significant. Not to mention the 3% who owned stock, those guys tended to be the business leaders. So when they lost their money, their businesses lost their money as well. People were engaged in speculation. That is, they bought stocks and bonds on the chance of a quick profit while ignoring the risks. That's easy enough to remember. To speculate means to sort of like guess about something without really knowing. Speculation is purchasing a risky stock, thinking that there's a chance it might go bust, and then there's a chance it could really raise up. So, and a lot of people, as we mentioned, were purchasing on margin, which purchasing on margin, which for For our purposes, we'll simplify it. Basically, buying stock with a loan. And again, there was that laissez-faire attitude that the government really did not regulate the stocks very heavily, and they were allowing the market to regulate itself, quote unquote, to regulate. But of course, that didn't work out. So in early September 1929, stock prices peaked and then fell. Confidence in the market started to waver, and some investors quickly sold their stocks and pulled out. So once these major investors start pulling out their money, that really has a domino effect. It's a nation-sick economy. The stock market crash signaled the beginning of the Great Depression, a period from 1929 to 1940 in which the economy plummeted and unemployment skyrocketed. The crash alone did not cause the Great Depression, but it hastened the collapse of the economy and made the Depression more severe. So here are the Depression era numbers for tariffs being tax on imported goods. Excuse me. In terms of unemployment. So people working in industrial production, 46% of them lost their jobs. 32% in wholesale prices. You can see these are just general metrics to show you economic conditions during the era. So remember, only 2 to 3% owned stocks. So that leaves 97 and 98% who did not. Business owners and investors who couldn't pay their loans left banks with no income. So for that other 97, 98%, some of them probably just had their money in a jar buried in the backyard. Some of it might have been stuffed under their mattress. But for a lot of just regular Americans, they had their money in banks, in regular banks, community banks. So when those banks went broke, they didn't have that person's money. You would start an account at a bank, just like you guys will one day if you haven't already, and like most every American adult does. And imagine putting your money in, stock market crashes, and the bank says we just don't have it, we can't pay it back. So there were runs on banks where people were just like in an absolute panic trying to get their cash out. It was chaos. So these banks had no income, they couldn't pay back their debts, right? Because you give your money to a bank to hold, that bank can invest it, and if that bank's investments poof up, then there goes your money. So between 1930 and 1932, more than 5,000 U.S. banks failed. People lost their life savings. By 1933, 28 states, we already said that. But that does bear repeating. 28 states didn't have a bank. Economic practices of the 1920s. And this is a super long PowerPoint. I really like it, but we're not going to go through it all today. We've got about 5 minutes left, and then I'm going to wrap it up within that 30-minute time frame. So economic practices of the 20s. In 1929, average yearly income was at an all-time high. Average consumer spending was also at an all-time high. That's going to be this green line down here. You can see from 29 to 30 goes down dramatically, continues to go down, and then by 1933, they both plummeted. Another issue was that 80% of Americans going into this had zero savings. They were living paycheck to paycheck. Um, so there was no reserve for most of these families. A lot of families do that still. But what that means is if you're living essentially week by week, when the system collapses, you don't have a safety net. You have no way to uh, insulate yourself from all the hardship. So not having any savings and buying things on credit, that's not a good combination. Americans were buying less, mainly because of rising prices, stagnant wages, unbalanced distribution of wealth, and overbuying on credit in the preceding years. So stagnant wages, meaning the money they were getting for their jobs wasn't rising as fast as inflation. So rising prices or inflation, stagnant wages, not getting paid more money, unbalanced distribution of income. In other words, the vast majority of the money going to a very small minority of citizens, and then overbuying on credit, spending money that you didn't have, while just crossing your fingers that things would keep going as they were, and then you could keep on staying one step ahead of the repo guy. So production had also expanded much faster than wages, resulting in an ever widening gap between the rich and the poor. There's still extreme income disparity, and I won't try to brainwash you, but that's still a major thing in the United States. Um, so, although many Americans appeared to be prosperous during the 1920s, in fact, they were living beyond their means. Beyond their means, meaning just they were spending more money than they could afford to spend. And buying on credit allowed you to do that. By 1929, some economists had warned of weaknesses in the economy, but most Americans maintained the utmost confidence in the nation's economic health. These were times of unprecedented prosperity, and a lot of Americans just couldn't bring themselves to believe that the American financial system could collapse. We might circle back around to this thing about the Sears catalog. Well, what the heck? My parents have told me stories about this, but Sears used to sell everything from swords to whatever that is, suspensory bandages, hypodermic syringes, of course, a trumpet of some kind. So the reason I bring up Sears is that you're not going to be ordering, oh, here we go, an early predecessor to the Spanx. You're not going to order this. If you have zero savings, you can't order something from the Sears catalog unless you have a credit card. So people were purchasing things left and right, really not understanding or not caring or respecting the dangers they were taking, the financial risk that they were taking. You purchase a complete home. Here's a home entitled The Ferry that you could get for $945. The Americas looks nice. That's $2,096. So anyway, this consumer spending, we're getting mass media marketing all these products at a level we've never seen before, and all of this stuff just combines to set the stage and ultimately to result in a Great Depression. So, guys, with that, we'll stop and we'll pick it up here tomorrow. I don't want to spend too much time talking depression because I'm all about positivity. So we'll spend tomorrow talking about this, and we'll get into the New Deal. Take it easy.